here and very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Richard Painter. Richard Painter is a tenured law professor at the University of Minnesota and a former fellow at the Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. Professor Painter has also been active in law reform efforts aimed at deterring securities fraud and improving ethics of corporate managers and lawyers. He has on 6 separate occasions provided invited testimony before committees of the U.S. House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate on government ethics, securities litigation, and/or the role of attorneys in corporate governance. He has written op-eds on government ethics for various publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times. And most recently, he is the author of No Taxation Without Representation, a conservative case for campaign finance reform.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, it's getting hot in here. I'm from Minnesota. Snowstorm, quite a bit going on out there. We got this 2 days ago, so I shoveled it out there, and now I see it here. Well, I think it's tea party time, folks. I just published this book, Taxation Only With Representation, The Conservative Conscience in Campaign Finance Reform. And I spent a good part of the last year working on this book because I'm very worried about the situation we now confront in the United States. And I think conservatives, as I pointed out in my op-ed in the New York Times 2 days ago, conservatives need to be worried about this at least as much as everyone else, and I think we ought to be leading the charge. There are a lot of concerns that all Americans ought to have, but I describe in this book that particularly those Americans who identify themselves as conservatives need to think seriously about. Now, there are many different types of conservatives, and I don't agree with all of them on everything. I've made it clear to one of the presidential candidates, I won't say who, that I disagree with him on immigration. Part of that, I'm a committed Christian. I read the Bible. I look what it has to say about how you treat other people and strangers in your midst, and I just don't agree with some of the statements that have been made. And I certainly believe in the Judgment Day, and that's not the day I want to be hanging around and standing next to someone with a sign that says no amnesty. But we all have different opinions, and we're entitled to that, and there are many different types of conservatives. But as I explained in this book, as I go through the different perspectives that people in America have on politics who call themselves conservative, there is one common ground, and that is that conservatives should embrace the system of representative democracy that our founding fathers created for us in the Constitution. And that's not what we've got. That's not what we have when the candidates for the 2 major political parties are pre-selected in what Larry Lessig calls the green primary that takes place often a year before anybody goes to the polls here in New Hampshire, where the donors are figuring out who they ought to back, who they shouldn't back, who they should tell other donors not to back. When the Koch brothers are having an audience out there in Kansas, or often they invite them all out to a fancy place in Santa Monica, California, and they sit around thinking about who ought to be the next president of the United States. Well, that's your decision. That's the people's decision. And that is a decision that we all have a role in making, and we ought to have that role from the very beginning of the process of selecting candidates of the 2 political parties or third parties, and then choosing who ultimately will be elected to public office. And in this book, I explain that political conservatives have for a long time worried about the cost of elections. Edmund Burke in England in the 18th century worried about the cost of elections to Parliament. He was a member of Parliament. He had to deal with it. And the corrupting influence of the cost of elections. Barry Goldwater made it very clear in his book, The Conscience of a Conservative, that corporate money and union money should stay out of political campaigns. It is individuals who should be giving to political campaigns, not corporations and unions. John McCain, another Republican senator from Arizona, who was nominated for President of the United States, spent much of his professional career in Washington trying to solve this problem. and passing legislation that sought to solve the problem and then was partially struck down by the United States Supreme Court. Conservatives have a track record of commitment to this cause. But ironically, we are unable to get traction from our current elected representatives in the House and the Senate. We're unable to get legislation passed that would do such basic things as bring transparency to the political funding scenario, where you have money, dark money, coming into the 501c4 organizations and other groups with no disclosure of who the donors are. The disclosure with respect to the super PACs is inadequate, and yet Congress is not willing to do anything. Even though the polling data is clear, the vast majority of voters, conservative, moderate, and liberal, are demanding change. The members of Congress won't do anything. And I think the reason why is quite clear. Because they're thinking about where they're getting their money from. That's the number one priority, and then the votes are presumed to come later on because we don't have any choice. We have one party candidate chosen by the donors, and then another. And that's what we get, and the politicians know that. There's nothing we can do about it. Well, yes, there is, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. But first, what are the specific concerns that those of us who would call ourselves politically conservative should think about? How about big government? Government contracts, wasteful government contracts, are driven by Washington, D.C. lobbyists who raise money for politicians. And that is where we get defense appropriations that we do not need for equipment the Pentagon says it does not need. That is where we get bridges to nowhere. That is where we get solar energy companies that don't produce much energy and go bankrupt. That is where we get the pork barrel spending that is really crippling our government. And this is money that comes out of the taxpayer. That's coming out of your wallet. But it is those spending decisions are being made not on the merits. Those spending decisions are being made because Washington lobbyists with campaign contributions and their clients making campaign contributions, great big bundles, going to the members of Congress who see to it that those earmarks and other appropriations go into spending bills, and then put pressure on the executive branch to spend that money. That is wasteful government spending, and that's the first thing that conservatives should object to. But we need to cut off the cause of that at its root, and that is the campaign finance system. Second, regulation. Now, there's good regulation, there's bad regulation. I just wrote a book last October on the banking industry and the debacle that we had in 2008 and the lack of personal responsibility in the investment banking industry. And I had some ideas in that book about how we might have some simpler regulation that would actually impose personal responsibility on bankers. Like, for example, maybe having them be personally responsible if their firm failed. That was the old rule when they were general partnerships. Well, that idea is too old-fashioned. It's also too simple. Why not have 1,000 pages of regulation of the DoddFrank Act that I'm still struggling to understand, and then they keep adding exceptions as the lobbyists get exceptions in there, not only in the original DoddFrank Act, but in subsequent legislation that carves out exceptions that, of course, are beneficial to the largest banks, while the regulatory environment continues to impose enormous burdens on small and medium-sized banks. To the contributions being made by regulated industry. And the politicians know that. Now, do you think the politicians are really going to deregulate an industry entirely? No, that cuts off the money supply for them. What they will do is pass enormously complex regulations that are very burdensome and then say, okay, well, now come to us for an exception. And then the exception will be given to those who pay for it. Well, that's not how our banking system should work. That's not how our energy regulation should work, or any other regime. A regulatory regime is not an extortion racket. And that is what's going on here. And business needs to understand that what's going on is the politicians will impose the regulations, and then they will expect you to come to them with a campaign contribution to get anything changed. And that's not what regulation should be. Regulation should be about protecting the public interest, where the government regulation is necessary, and not regulating where it's not necessary. It shouldn't be an engine for driving campaign contributions and lobbyist fees, and we see more and more of that. And the corporate community is well aware of that, because a number of corporations, actually quite a few, lobbied for the Tillman Act way back in 1907 when they sought to prohibit direct campaign contributions by corporations. The problem is, you pass a law like that, and the lawyers go to work figuring out a way around it. And the corporations all then set up PACs. And they contribute to super PACs, and they get the 501c4 organizations and the rest of it. But our campaign finance system lies at the heart of the mess that federal regulatory policy is today. And anyone who objects to over-regulation or malfunctioning regulatory regime ought to look at our campaign finance system. Then let's talk about social conservatives' perspective on the political arena. And here also, I've disagreed on some issues. I'm a strong believer in traditional marriage. I also think it's a constitutional right. That if someone wants to be married to a person of their choice, that the government shouldn't be getting in there and regulating that. So I've had my disagreements with social conservatives on some issues. But let's step back from whatever we may think about the different issues that social conservatives are worried about, and think about the decision-making process. How should we decide such critical issues as the value of human life, when human life begins and when it ends? How should we decide these issues? Should we decide these issues based upon a debate among the people and their elected representatives, based on their principles and what they believe is right or wrong? Or should we be deciding these issues based on who has the most money? And I believe that social conservatives increasingly, particularly faith-based voters, who can only donate through their churches. If they're working through their churches, they cannot support political candidates through their churches. The church is not even allowed to endorse a candidate, much less fund a candidate. The individual parishioners can. But the churches and the synagogues, they can't do that. Most faith-based voters have spent a lot of their time with 501c3 charitable organizations that have severe restrictions with respect to politics. And most important, many of them are middle-class people. They don't have the money to throw into politics. So in each of these issues, who are they up against? Business. Big businesses. Let's go through the issue. The beginning of life. When does it begin? When does it end? We can have that discussion. But should those decisions and decisions about what happens, whether you have a pregnancy that may have very complex medical follow-through if the baby's born, a very expensive medical treatment, should those decisions be made by individuals? Should those decisions be made when there is an argument that there's a human life to be protected with some role discussion? But should those decisions be made by politicians who are getting money from health insurance companies and from companies that are paying for the health insurance for their employees and have one objective, which is to control costs? I don't think so. These decisions need to be made based on values, and these are values, as I say, where individuals should be able to disagree and have a discussion, but it is not a decision to be made based on money. And the same at the end of life with respect to euthanasia and other issues. Faith-based voters, whatever their opinion is on questions of human life, should recognize that these decisions should be made in terms of dollars and cents, and it should not be the insurance companies and those who pay for health insurance who are making those decisions in the legislature through their campaign contributions. And then let's talk about gambling, which has for years been viewed by many in the religious community as immoral, and yet it's spreading now on the internet. Now some would say that the stock market these days just become another version of gambling, but put that aside. The gambling industry is one of the largest contributors to both political parties, particularly my own Republican Party, with major contributors who want to spread gambling throughout the world and others who want to bring it on the internet. And these are decisions to be made by the people. And yet, how much money is there in politics opposing the gambling industry compared with what the gambling industry is putting into politics? And then we could talk about the drug companies. Now, I mentioned the issues of human life and abortion. Well, who makes Plan B? Drug companies. Once again, maybe that's a good product. Maybe that should be on the market. Maybe not. But a decision for the people, not a decision that should be rammed down anybody's throat by the drug company through campaign contributions. And drugs soon to move into recreational drugs, and that will be a huge industry. There's already a pot pack. And drugs, of course, you know, according to a drug dealer, that's only the introductory product, and there are many other products, and all of that may be legal. We can discuss whether that should be or should not be, but the recreational drug industry should not be able to drive a wedge into the American political system through contributions, and that will happen, and those companies could eventually be taken over, it maybe sooner than we think, by traditional drug companies. We see issue after issue. Social conservatives are going to be outgunned in the political arena. School choice is another one. The teachers' unions pour an enormous amount of money into political campaigns. How much money is there that is specifically focused on school choice? Yes, there's corporate money going to candidates who say they're in favor of school choice, but that's different. That is not money that is going to take a walk from those candidates if they don't follow through on their promises. Whereas the teachers' unions are pouring many, many millions of dollars into campaigns. Once again, social conservatives who care about that issue need to face the facts that in this campaign environment, with the money coming in, they are at a severe disadvantage on whatever issue they care about. And I used at the beginning of that chapter of this book the story from the Gospel of Luke about the widow who comes and puts a few coins in the temple treasury. And Jesus points out that those coins, that her contribution is as important as those very rich men who are pouring in a great deal more money, and who because of it think they are more influential in matters of theology and in the governance of the community. That poor widow who's given everything she has, that her voice is of value. And that's the message we need to listen to. And social conservatives need to wake up to the fact that they do not have a seat at the table, will not have a seat at the table in either political party in this current campaign finance regime. Last, are you worried about our national security? Well, then ask yourself, where's the money coming from? Well, the money, of course, is all American. Why? Because it's illegal for foreigners, foreign corporations to donate money to American political campaigns. It's right there in a statute passed back in the 1960s. And because it's illegal, it doesn't happen. You know, it's illegal to drink under the age of 21. That doesn't happen either. Okay? Well, I can tell you it's easier to get foreign money into a U.S. political campaign than it is to get booze on a typical college campus. And I've lived with both. Think of the ways a foreign corporation takes over an American company. Their American subsidiary can form a PAC. That's perfectly legal. At least that's disclosed if they have a PAC, and many of them do. But then there are the undisclosed mechanisms. Because of the 501c4 organizations, these are the organizations that are not donating to political candidates. They do not work with political candidates. Oh no. And we don't know where their money's coming from. It is undisclosed, and yet they have a constitutional right under the Citizens United case to free speech. And their corporate donors have a right to free speech. And their donors from wherever, who we don't know who they are, have a right to free speech. And this money will be coming in from all over the world. It has to. That's the way it's going to work. If we equate corporate wealth with First Amendment rights to determine who runs the United States government, we need to recognize that corporate wealth is global. And global corporate wealth is going to be making those decisions about how that money is spent. Now, if you believe in world government, that's great. So I would say to everybody out there who refuses to fix this system, that the path you are putting our country toward is a path where we are going to be dominated by other countries, where we are going to be carved up into spheres of influence. Not geographically, the way the world powers did to China back in the 19th and early 20th century, but in Congress. It won't be disclosed. We won't know who these people are and where the money's coming from, but the members of Congress, well, they will know who they are dependent upon. And when they cast those votes on issues critical to our national security, they will know who can pull the rug out from under them and who can fund their opponent. We will be carved up into spheres of influence. We've been there. That's why we had the Tea Party. That's why we had the American Revolution. We didn't like that idea of people back in London making decisions. And earlier in our history, it was people in Spain, people in France, even Alaska, it was Russia. I mean, our country has been under the thumb of world financial powers before, and we can go back there, and we're putting ourselves on that path with this campaign finance system. It's non-citizens united, and it will be, and we're going to have to confront that. And it is a serious national security concern. And anybody who does not admit that is denying what is inevitable in a global economy. Corporations are no longer just American. It's not just somebody sitting down there in Kentucky on the veranda with Mitch McConnell sipping mint juleps or something, an American corporation. These are people from all over who are going to be influencing the composition of our government. For Americans, that ought to be unacceptable. So now, we'll talk about what am I going to do about it. What I suggest here is that taxation needs to be conditioned upon the right to representation. That was the point of the Tea Party, and that's what the Constitution should say, and that's what the statutes could say. We could do this either in the Constitution or in a statute. That the government shall have no right to tax anybody. Income tax, property tax, sales tax, nothing. No taxes. Now, I know my most conservative friends would say stop there. But I would say unless the government has given each citizen of voting age the right to designate the first $200 of his or her taxes to the candidate of his or her choice. And that would be the taxation only with representation. It can be passed as a constitutional amendment to the United States Constitution, to the state constitution. It could be passed as a statute. The problem with the statute, it could be repealed. But that's better than nothing. We had that in Minnesota. We had, at least $40 or so, and then the legislature decided, well, we have a budget crunch. We ought to get rid of it. I don't know who really made that decision. So they put it on ice for 2 years. But the bottom line is this is what we need. Taxation only with representation. A constitutional right to that $200, a candidate of your choice, before you pay any more taxes. Why? Because you have the right to choose that government, and that is the government that is spending, wasting, or I don't know what they do with it, with the rest of the money. But you have the right to choose that government. The government should not be chosen by the Koch brothers. It shouldn't be chosen by somebody on the other side of the globe. It should be chosen by you, the people. So we need a government by the people, and we need to bring that government back now. And invite any questions, and thank you very much for having me here in New Hampshire.
Thank you so much, Richard Painter. We have time for 1 or 2 questions, if there's any questions in the audience. Yes, sir.
Mr. Painter, Mike Dillon from Manchester. I may be a little bit off the reservation here, but I heard securities and tax expertise, so I'm going to take a stab here. Any suggestions about courses of action when Securities and Exchange Commission, Internal Revenue Service, U.S. court systems won't even uphold their laws? What do you do?
So they don't want to what?
When they won't uphold even their own laws and regulations.
Well, there's a bit of pride. I do a lot of work with the Securities Exchange Commission. And that's a whole nother story. You can buy my book on bankers' ethics to learn about that one. But the one thing I want to say is the Securities Exchange Commission is stalling on a proposal to require registered companies, and to include foreign companies that register in the United States, have their securities traded here, and it would include, of course, the American companies that have their securities traded here. There is a proposed rule that will require disclosure of electioneering communications by those corporations. That rule should be implemented by the SEC. It should have been done a long time ago. There's a lot of debate going back and forth, and nothing is happening. And I understand the chairwoman of the SEC does not support it. I don't know why. But that's one of the first things the SEC ought to be doing to help solve this problem. There's been a lot of concern about the SEC and other regulatory agencies getting too close to industry. Part of that's a revolving door in and out, and jobs and the other areas in terms of ethics that we need to think about to fix the system. The campaign contributions is the #1 issue, the campaign finance system. And the SEC certainly isn't doing their part on that.
Thank you, Professor. Any other questions for Professor Painter? Yes, sir.
Kevin Johnson from Lexington, Massachusetts, and I'm just curious, you know, how much of the success of Donald Trump's campaign do you think has to do with dissatisfaction over campaign finance?
Well, I won't talk about any campaign, but I think there is dissatisfaction in both political parties among independents with the current political system, because people feel, and I think rightfully so, that everything's rigged, and rigged in advance. And a lot of resentment. But I'm also going to say, I think that's a very dangerous situation for America. When you have ordinary people who feel disenfranchised, who don't think they have a role. And this does not bode well for representative democracy. In the Weimar Republic, they had a situation where large numbers of people in Germany in their late 20s and early 30s were feeling disenfranchised, were feeling out, that the government was not looking out after their interests, and that foreign powers were dictating things to the government. The system wasn't working, and the parties, people gravitated to the extremes. Communists on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you had politicians who would combine nationalism with a strange read of socialism, and somehow said, well, if you have an authoritarian government, that's somehow going to make the country restore the former glory of the country, and then bring in racism. It is a very dangerous situation. And voters need to be responsible when they make their decisions. But when there's a lot of resentment out there toward the system because people feel it's rigged, that could drive voters to making some very bad decisions. And I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you, Professor. Is there a last question for Professor Painter? Would you join me in thanking Professor Richard Painter?
Thank Thank you.
Traveled all the way in this morning from Minneapolis, Minnesota, to experience the warm climes of New Hampshire.
Well, good luck on Tuesday.
And if you have not yet, we encourage you to pick up a copy of his new book, which has been published just recently, Only Taxation with Representation.